The elderly man stood at the counter, his weathered hands trembling as he tried to count out his change for a simple cup of coffee. "Maybe you should try the Kitty hot chocolate instead, Gramps. At least when you spill that, it won't be so." "Hot!" the barista sneered, loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. The small crowd of morning customers shifted uncomfortably, some averting their eyes, others snickering behind their phones as the old man's cheeks flushed with humiliation. What no one realized was that those shaking hands had once diffused explosives under enemy fire, saving an entire platoon from certain death, or that the quiet man in the worn jacket had received honors that most would never understand. But in exactly 6 minutes, when 3 military police vehicles would screech to a halt outside the cafe's entrance, everyone was about to learn a lesson in respect they'd never forget. In the far corner of the cafe, a young woman lowered her coffee cup, her eyes narrowing at the scene unfolding before her. Sarah Chen had come to this small-town cafe seeking a quiet place to work on her graduate thesis. But what she witnessed now pushed all thoughts of academic deadlines from her mind. The elderly man's quiet dignity in the face of such casual cruelty stirred something deep within her. Sarah watched as he carefully tucked his wallet back into his jacket, the tremor in his hands more pronounced now. His weathered face remained stoic, but she caught the flash of pain in his eyes, not from anger, but from something deeper, a wound reopened by careless words. She knew that look. She'd seen it in her father's eyes too many times. The barista continued her performance, mimicking his trembling hands to the amusement of a few younger customers near the counter. The man said nothing, simply nodded his thanks when she finally slid his coffee across the counter, some of it sloshing over the sides. "Careful now, it's hot," the barista said with exaggerated concern, earning a few more snickers. Sarah's hand moved to her phone before she had even made a conscious decision. Her fingers found the contact she needed, one she rarely used but had never deleted. As the elderly man made his way to an empty table by the window, she pressed the call button and waited, her eyes never leaving him. "Colonel Ramirez," a gruffer voice answered on the third ring. "Sir, it's Sarah Chen," she said quietly, turning slightly toward the wall. "Lieutenant Chen's daughter." A pause. "Sarah, is everything all right?" "I'm not sure," she replied, keeping her voice low. "I'm at the Riverside Cafe on Maple Street, and there's an older gentleman here. He's being mistreated. But that's not why I'm calling." The elderly man had set his coffee down and was now unfolding a newspaper with methodical precision, as if performing a ritual that required all his concentration. "I think he might be someone you know," Sarah continued. "He has this pin on his jacket. It's small, but I recognize it from my father's things." "What kind of pin?" the colonel's voice sharpened with interest. "EOD," she said simply. "And his hands, they shake badly, the way my father's did after Fallujah." Another pause, longer this time. "Can you describe him?" Sarah did, noting the military straight posture despite his age, the precision in his movements. Despite the tremor, the quiet watchfulness in his eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. "And the barista who mocked him, what's her name?" Sarah glanced at the counter. "Her name tag says Melissa. Does she have a small tattoo behind her right ear? Looks like 3 stars." Sarah shifted in her seat to get a better view. "Yes." "How did you—" "Sarah, listen to me carefully," Colonel Ramirez interrupted, his voice deadly serious now. "That man is Major Frank Delaney, one of the finest EOD specialists this country has ever produced. And that barista is not who she claims to be. We've been looking for her for months." "I don't understand." "You don't need to. Just do exactly as I say. Stay where you are. Keep an eye on them both. Do not approach either of them. We'll have people there in 6 minutes." 6 minutes, Sarah repeated, a chill running down her spine at the precision of his timeline. "And Sarah," the colonel added before hanging up, "you did the right thing calling me. Your father would be proud." The line went dead, and Sarah set her phone down on the table, her heart racing. She looked at the elderly man, Major Delaney, with new eyes, wondering what invisible burdens those shaking hands had carried, what horrors they had disarmed, what lives they had saved. And she wondered what secrets the smirking barista was hiding behind her cruel smile. 5 minutes to go. Sarah took a sip of her now cold coffee and waited, the only person in the cafe who knew that everything was about to change. Earlier that morning, before the first light had crept over the horizon, Frank Delaney had already been awake for hours. Sleep came rarely to him these days, fragments of rest between nightmares that never seemed to fade, even after all these years. His doctor called it PTSD. Frank just called it remembering. He'd made his bed with military precision, the corners tight enough to bounce a quarter, a habit from decades ago that his body remembered even when his mind wandered. The small bedroom in his modest one-story home was sparsely furnished. A bed, a dresser, a nightstand with a single photograph. No medals on display, no shadow boxes of honors received. Those remained in a footlocker under his bed, hidden away like the memories they represented. By 5:30 a.m., Frank was dressed in pressed khakis and a clean button-down shirt beneath his worn navy jacket. The tremor in his hands made shaving difficult, but he persisted with the straight razor that had been his father's, nicking himself only once. The small EOD pin on his jacket's lapel was the only visible sign of his service, a private reminder rather than a public declaration. His morning walk took him 3 blocks to Hillside Cemetery, where the groundskeeper nodded in recognition as Frank made his way to the eastern section. He knew the path by heart, 37 steps from the oak tree, then right for another 18. Margaret's headstone was simple granite, her name and the dates of her birth and death engraved alongside the words, "Beloved wife, forever missed." "Morning, Maggie," Frank said softly, placing a single daisy at the base of the stone. Another day. They had had 42 years together before cancer took her. 5 years since then, each day a practice in learning to exist in a world without her. She'd always understood about his hands, had learned to hold them steady with her, own when the tremors came, had never once shown impatience when he dropped things or knocked over glasses at dinner. "Town's pretty quiet," he continued, easing himself down onto the small bench he'd installed beside her grave. "Mrs. Peterson's grandson graduated college, engineering, just like he always wanted." He spoke quietly about neighborhood happenings, local news, anything but his own loneliness. The tremors were particularly bad this morning. They always worsened with cold weather or lack of sleep. His right hand, his dominant hand, suffered the worst of it, the fingers curling involuntarily. At times, a permanent reminder of the IED that had nearly killed him and his entire unit outside of Kandahar. He could still feel the wires beneath his fingertips, the sweat rolling down his back as he'd worked to disarm the complex device hidden beneath. A dead child's body. The memory of it sent a fresh tremor through his hands, and he gripped the edge of the bench to steady himself. "I was supposed to warm up today," he told Margaret, forcing his mind back to the present. "Thought I'd get coffee at that place on Maple, the one with the cranberry muffins you always liked." The Riverside Cafe had been their spot. Sunday mornings, for coffee and muffins, Margaret's hand steady on his arm as they'd walked the 6 blocks from their home. After she died, he'd stopped going for nearly a year. Now he made himself visit once a week, a small act of defiance against grief's isolation. As Frank rose to leave, his knees protesting the cold and the hard bench, he touched the headstone one last time. "I'll be back tomorrow, Maggie." The walk to the cafe took longer these days. His pace had slowed with age and injury, each step measured and deliberate. Along the way, he passed familiar storefronts, nodding to the few early risers who crossed his path, most strangers, a few acquaintances, none he would call friends. Margaret had been the social one. Without her, he'd retreated into solitude. The Riverside Cafe came into view, its windows glowing warm against the early morning darkness. Frank paused outside, steeling himself for the noise, the people, the potential stares at his shaking hands. Then, drawing himself up with the same courage that had once guided him through minefields, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The smell of coffee and pastries enveloped him, a bittersweet reminder of happier mornings. For a moment, he could almost feel Margaret beside him, hear her voice asking for one of those cranberry ones, please. Then reality settled back in as he approached the counter, already reaching for his wallet, already aware of how difficult counting change would be this morning. Colonel Victor Ramirez stared at his phone for exactly 3 seconds after Sarah Chen's call ended. Then, with the decisive efficiency that had marked his 30-year military career, he pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Lieutenant Wallace, get me General Hayes and the MP unit. Priority 1. Less than 30 seconds later, his secure line rang. "This is Hayes. Sir, it's Ramirez. We found her, Melissa Winters. She's working at a cafe in Riverside. And sir, there's something else. Major Frank Delaney is there." The silence on the other end spoke volumes. General Michael Hayes had personally awarded Frank Delaney his Silver Star after the Kandahar incident. He'd visited him in the hospital when the nerve damage prognosis came in. And he'd attended Margaret Delaney's funeral, standing solemnly. At the back, watching his old friend crumble under a weight heavier than any battlefield burden. "Frank?" The general's voice softened momentarily before snapping back to command tone. "Confirmed visual ID?" "No, sir." "Civilian recognition, but the description matches, including the EOD pin and the hand tremors. And sir, according to my contact, the Winters woman is mocking him. Publicly." A sharp intake of breath was the only indication of the general's anger. "Your contact is reliable?" Lieutenant Chen's daughter. She recognized the EOD pin from her father's effects. "Dispatch MPs immediately. I want Winters in custody and I want verification on Delaney. If it's him, I want a senior officer on site within the hour." "Yes, sir. I've already alerted the MP unit. They're 4 minutes out," while Colonel Ramirez coordinated with military. Police across the base. Sergeant Major Elijah Washington was reviewing the Winters file with growing disgust. 6 military spouses impersonated over the past 3 years. Over $400,000 stolen from support organizations and benefits programs. Countless civilians duped by her sob stories about her deployed husband. The 3-star tattoo behind her ear was her signature, a calling card she'd started using after her first successful scam. It had actually helped them track her pattern across multiple states, but she'd always managed to disappear just before they closed in. Until now. "Sergeant Torres, Fuller, Johnson, gear up," Washington barked, grabbing his service weapon and badge. "Target located at Riverside Cafe on Maple. Civilian present is high-value veteran. No sirens until final approach." As the MP team loaded into their vehicles, Washington's phone buzzed with a text from the Colonel Ramirez. "General Hayes wants Delaney confirmed and protected. Fuller knows him. Bring him." Washington nodded to himself. Corporal Fuller had served under Delaney in Afghanistan before the major's injury. Good choice for positive ID. 3 minutes and 40 seconds after Sarah Chen's call, 3 military police vehicles pulled out of Fort Carson, moving with purpose toward the small town of Riverside. Meanwhile, General Hayes had made a call of his own to Brigadier General Catherine Marshall, commander of the 71st Ordnance Group. "Kate, it's Mike Hayes. We found Frank Delaney." The sharp intake of breath was audible. "After all this time? Where?" "Coffee shop in Riverside. But that's not why I'm calling. We also found Melissa Winters. Same location. The military spouse impersonator? The one who's been bleeding the family support fund dry?" "The same. MPs are en route now. But I wanted to give you a heads up. Your team has history with Frank. I thought someone should be there who understands what he did for them." General Marshall didn't hesitate. "I'm sending Captain Rodriguez. He was with Frank in Kandahar when—" She paused. "He still has the piece of shrapnel they pulled out of Frank's hand, framed on his wall. Says it reminds him why he's alive." "Good choice. And Kate? We need to handle this carefully. According to our witness, Frank's being publicly humiliated because of his disability, the same disability he got saving your men." The silence that followed was heavy with shared understanding. In the close-knit world of EOD specialists, Frank Delaney was a legend, not just for his technical skills, but for his unwavering courage under circumstances that would break most humans. Mike, I want to be kept in the loop on every development. And when this is over, I want to see him myself. Understood. As General Hayes hung up, he looked at the framed photograph on his desk, his old EOD unit from Desert Storm. Frank stood at the end of the line, young and steady-handed then, a half-smile on his face. Hayes touched the frame briefly before turning to his computer to send an official alert up the chain of command. At the Pentagon, a notification appeared on a secure terminal. 2 minutes later, a call was placed to the Secretary of Defense. Frank Delaney's name traveled up through the highest echelons of military command. A quiet reminder that some people are never forgotten by those who understand their sacrifice. In the Riverside Cafe, Frank Delaney sat with his newspaper, unaware that his presence had set in motion a chain reaction across military channels. Unaware that in less than a minute, everything was about to change. 58 seconds to go. The screech of tires outside the Riverside Cafe cut through the morning chatter like a knife. Conversations halted mid-sentence as heads turned towards the large windows facing the street. 3 military police vehicles had pulled up to the curb, their dark profiles unmistakable against the quaint storefronts of Maple Street. Sarah Chen set down her coffee cup, her heart racing. Exactly 6 minutes, just as Colonel Ramirez had promised. She glanced at Frank Delaney, who hadn't looked up from his newspaper, either oblivious to the commotion or choosing to ignore it. Behind the counter, Jake nudged Melissa, who was busy, taking a selfie for her Instagram page. Mel? Why are there MPs outside?" Melissa glanced up, her face registering confusion, then a flicker of something else. Recognition, followed quickly by fear. The phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the counter as the color drained from her face. "Probably just getting coffee," she said, her voice higher than normal. "No big deal." But it was clearly a big deal. Even the most oblivious customers could sense it as 4 uniformed military police officers entered the cafe, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Behind them came a 5th man, older, with sergeant's stripes and an air of absolute authority. The cafe fell completely. Silent. The lead officer scanned the room, his gaze passing over the customers until it locked on Melissa behind the counter. His face hardened almost imperceptibly. "Nobody move," he announced, his voice firm but controlled. "This is official military police business." A murmur of confusion swept through the cafe. An older woman clutched her purse to her chest. A businessman, in a suit, froze with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. 2 college students exchanged wide-eyed glances, clearly wondering if they should make a break for it. In her corner, Sarah Chen remained still, watching as the drama she had set in motion unfolded before her. She noticed that while every other person in the cafe was staring at the military police in shock or alarm, Frank Delaney had finally looked up from his newspaper, not at the officers, but directly at her. His weathered face revealed nothing, but his eyes held a question. Sergeant Major Washington approached the counter with measured steps, flanked by 2 officers. "Melissa Winters?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Melissa's hand moved to the back door behind her. "There's some mistake," she stammered. "My name is Melissa Johnson. This is my uncle's cafe." Washington didn't blink. "Ma'am, we have a positive ID on the 3-star tattoo behind your right ear. We've been tracking you across 4 states." The cafe erupted in whispers. Jake stepped away from Melissa as if she had suddenly become radioactive. "What's going on?" Terry Johnson emerged from the back office, wiping his hands on his apron. "Why are there military police in my cafe?" Washington turned slightly to address him while keeping Melissa in his peripheral vision. "Sir, this woman is not your niece. Her real name is Melissa Winters, and she's wanted for multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and impersonating military dependents for financial gain." Terry's face crumpled in confusion. "What? Mel, what's he talking about?" But Melissa wasn't listening. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, seeking an escape route. Finding none, her expression hardened into defiance. "You can't prove anything," she spat, "and this is harassment. I have rights." "You have the right to remain silent," one of the officers said, moving forward with handcuffs. "You have the right to—" "I'm not going anywhere!" Melissa shrieked, grabbing a coffee pot and hurling it at the approaching officer. Hot coffee splashed across the counter as customers gasped and scrambled back. The officer dodged most of the scalding liquid, but not all. In the momentary chaos, Melissa bolted for the back door, only to find it blocked by 2 more MPs who had circled around the building, anticipating exactly this reaction. "Don't make this worse for yourself," Sergeant Washington said calmly. Trapped. Melissa spun around, her face contorted with rage and fear. Her gaze landed on Frank Delaney, still seated calmly at his table by the window, watching the scene unfold with the steady gaze of a man who had seen far worse chaos in his lifetime. "This is your fault, isn't it?" she hissed at him. "What did you do, call your old war buddies to scare me?" Frank said nothing, his expression unchanged, his hands resting on the newspaper before him, trembling slightly, as always. A hush fell over the cafe as Corporal Fuller, the youngest of the MPs, stepped away from the group and approached Frank's table. Those watching expected an arrest, questions, something official. Instead, the young corporal came to attention and rendered a perfect formal salute. "Major Delaney, sir," he said, his voice carrying in the silent cafe. "It's an honor to see you again." The collective intake of breath from the cafe patrons was audible. Every eye turned to the quiet old man with the shaking hands, seeing him, truly seeing him, for the first time. Sergeant Major Washington approached Melissa with cold precision while the cafe remained frozen in stunned silence. Corporal Fuller remained at attention near Frank's table, a living barrier between the veteran and the chaos unfolding near the counter. "Melissa Winters," Washington began, his voice carrying the weight of official authority, "you are under arrest for multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, stolen valor, and misappropriation of funds intended for military families." Melissa's defiance crumbled visibly. "You don't understand," she pleaded, her voice shifting to a practiced vulnerability that had served her well in previous cons. "My husband is deployed overseas. I was just trying to—" "You have no husband in the military," Washington cut her off. "According to our records, you've claimed to be married to a Staff Sergeant James Winters, a Captain Michael Reynolds, and a Lieutenant Commander Thomas Parker, all within the past 18 months. None of these marriages exist," gasps rippled through the cafe. Terry Johnson stared at his supposed niece in horror. "The 3 stars behind your ear aren't a romantic symbol between you and a fictional husband," Washington continued, pulling out an official document. "They're a marker recognized by your associates in a multi-state fraud ring targeting military support organizations and grieving families." As an officer secured Melissa's hands behind her back with handcuffs, Washington removed his phone and displayed a series of photos. "Is this you at the Fort Bragg Family Support Center last February, and here at the Gold Star Mothers fundraiser in Colorado Springs? And this one, accepting donations for care packages that were never sent?" With each photo, Melissa seemed to shrink, her elaborate facade crumbling under the weight of irrefutable evidence. "That money was for families who had real needs," Washington said, his controlled tone not quite masking his disgust. "Families whose loved ones are actually in harm's way, children waiting for parents who might never come home." Terry shook his head in disbelief. "You told me you were my sister's daughter. I gave you a job, a place to stay. Standard operating procedure," one of the officers explained quietly. "She researches family structures, finds relatives who've lost touch, and inserts herself as a long-lost relation. Usually targets older individuals or those without close family nearby." Terry looked stricken. "My sister died 20 years ago. Her daughter would be about Melissa's age now. I never even met her." His voice trailed off as the magnitude of the deception hit him. "I want a lawyer," Melissa demanded, abandoning the vulnerable act as quickly as she'd adopted it. "I'm not saying anything else." "That's your right," Washington agreed. nodding to the officers to begin processing her. "But we've been building this case for over 3 years. We have witness statements from over 30 victims, financial records, and DNA evidence linking you to multiple crime scenes." As they began to lead Melissa toward the door, she suddenly locked eyes with Frank Delaney again. Something in his calm, steady gaze seemed to infuriate her beyond reason. "What are you looking at, old man?" she snarled. "You think you're better than me? With your pathetic shaking hands and your stupid little pin, you're nothing, just another washed-up vet. Living in the past." The cafe fell into shocked silence at her outburst. Several customers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with Frank, ashamed now of their earlier amusement at his expense. Washington stepped between Melissa and Frank, his expression darkening. "That old man," with a pathetic shaking. "Hands is Major Frank Delaney," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "One of the most decorated EOD specialists in U.S. military history. The tremors you mocked? He got those disarming an IED that would have killed 37 soldiers." He leaned closer to Melissa, his words for her alone, though many in the cafe strained to hear. "While you've been stealing from military families, Major Delaney has been living quietly with injuries he sustained, saving those families from becoming Gold Star dependents in the first place." Melissa's face drained of color as the full weight of her actions began to register. The cafe had transformed from a place where she held power into a court of public opinion where she stood condemned. One of the officers gave her a gentle but firm push toward the door. "Let's go." As they led her out, Melissa kept her head down, avoiding the stares of the cafe patrons who had witnessed her humiliation and exposure. The young college students who had laughed at her mockery of Frank now looked away in shame. Jake, who had worked alongside her for months, couldn't meet her eyes. Only Frank Delaney watched her exit with equanimity, his gaze neither vengeful nor satisfied. There was something almost like compassion in his eyes, the look of a man who had seen too much of human failing to take pleasure in anyone's downfall, even someone who had caused him pain. The bell above the door chimed as Melissa was escorted out to the waiting vehicles, leaving behind a cafe full of people struggling to process what they had just witnessed and what it revealed about the quiet elderly man with the trembling hands who had been in their midst all along. As the door closed behind Melissa and her military escort, the cafe remained suspended in uncomfortable silence. Corporal Fuller still stood at attention near Frank's table, maintaining his salute, until Frank finally acknowledged it with a small nod. "At ease, Corporal," Frank said quietly, his voice stronger and more commanding than anyone in the cafe had ever heard it. "That's not necessary." "With respect, sir, it absolutely is," Fuller replied, lowering his hand, but maintaining a formal posture. The young MP's face showed unmistakable reverence. "Kandahar, 2011. You pulled that tripwire from under Lieutenant Wallace's foot when the rest of us were ready to run." Frank's weathered face revealed nothing, but his eyes flickered with recognition. "You were there?" "Second squad, sir. I was a private then. We all thought we were dead when that secondary device was found. But you just—" Fuller shook his head, seemingly at a loss for words. "You just knelt down in the dirt and went to work like it was any other day." The cafe patrons listened in rapt attention, their earlier embarrassment giving way to a dawning realization about the man they had so casually dismissed. The bell above the door chimed again as a tall officer in dress uniform entered. Captain David Rodriguez moved with crisp efficiency, his eyes scanning the room until they found Frank. His presence commanded immediate attention, shoulders back, chin up, the embodiment of military bearing. "Major Delaney," he called across the cafe, his voice carrying easily through the hushed space. "Captain David Rodriguez, 71st Ordnance Group." Frank stood slowly, his posture straightening almost instinctively in response to the formal address. For a moment, the tremor in his hands seemed less pronounced as he slipped back into the role he had occupied for decades. Captain Rodriguez crossed the cafe in measured strides and, like Fuller before him, rendered a perfect salute. This time, Frank returned it properly, his right hand steady for just that moment as muscle memory took over. "General Marshall sends her regards, sir," Rodriguez said. She wanted to come herself, but she's overseeing an operation in Colorado Springs. "Catherine Marshall?" Frank asked, surprise registering briefly on his face. "She made general?" "Brigadier general last year, sir. She keeps your field manual on her desk, says it saved more lives than any other publication in EOD history." A murmur ran through the cafe. The customers and staff were beginning to understand that the quiet old man with the shaky hands wasn't just any veteran. He was someone significant, someone whose name still carried weight in military circles. Terry Johnson approached hesitantly from behind the counter, wiping his hands nervously on his apron. I don't understand. Major Delaney, you've been coming here for years, and I never knew." Frank's expression softened slightly. "No reason you should have, Mr. Johnson. I'm just a regular customer who enjoys your coffee." "But you're not regular at all, are you?" Terry persisted. "That officer said you were one of the most decorated EOD specialists in history." Captain Rodriguez nodded. "That's correct, sir. Major Frank Delaney holds the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, the Purple Heart, and numerous other commendations. He wrote the definitive field manual on complex explosive device disarmament that's still used in training today." Sarah Chen had risen from her corner table and now stood at the edge of the small crowd forming around Frank. She caught his eye and gave a small, respectful nod. Frank returned the nod with quiet understanding. "You made the call," he said. "It wasn't a question." "My father was Lieutenant James Chen," she replied. "He always said he owed his life to an EOD specialist who wouldn't leave a live device behind enemy lines, even when ordered to evacuate." Frank's eyes widened slightly in recognition. "Jimmy Chen, smart kid, good soldier." "He died 3 years ago," Sarah said softly. "But he never forgot what you did. He made sure I wouldn't either." The cafe had grown completely silent, everyone hanging on each word of this unexpected revelation. Jake, the young barista, who had watched Melissa's cruelty with disapproval, now looked at Frank with open admiration. "I don't understand," one elderly woman said from a nearby table. "What's EOD?" "Explosive Ordnance Disposal, ma'am," Captain Rodriguez explained. "The men and women who disarm bombs, IEDs, and other explosive threats, they go in when everyone else is running out." The woman's hand flew to her mouth. "And your hands?" she said, looking at Frank. "That's from—" Frank glanced down at his trembling hands, the permanent reminder of his last mission. "Nerve damage?" he said simply. "Part of the job." "Not just part of the job, sir," Rodriguez corrected respectfully. "You got those hands saving my entire unit in Kandahar. That IED was daisy-chained to 3 secondary devices. The evacuation order had already been given. You were supposed to be on the last helicopter out. And yet you stayed," Sarah added. "My father told me the story so many times. How everyone was ordered to fall back, but one EOD specialist refused. To leave until the device was disarmed." Frank shifted uncomfortably under the attention, but for the first time since entering the cafe that morning, he stood tall, not just physically, but with the unmistakable presence of the officer he had once been. Captain Rodriguez looked around at the rapt faces of the cafe patrons and made a decision. These civilians deserved to understand exactly who had been in their midst all this time. The man they had overlooked, whose disability had become the target of cruel mockery. "With your permission, Major," Rodriguez said formally, knowing that technically he needed no such permission to speak, but offering the respect that Frank Delaney had earned many times over. Frank gave a slight nod, though. His expression suggested he would have preferred to leave quietly. Rodriguez turned to address the cafe. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to tell you about Major Frank Delaney and why his hands shake." The cafe patrons drew closer, coffee cups forgotten, their attention completely focused on the captain. Even the 2 college students who had laughed at Melissa's cruel jokes earlier now looked on with chastened curiosity. Major Delaney served for 27 years in the United States Army, specializing in explosive ordnance disposal, what we call EOD. These are the men and women who run toward bombs while everyone else runs away. Rodriguez paused, gauging his audience. In 2011, Major Delaney was deployed to Kandahar, Afghanistan. He was scheduled to retire that year, his last tour after nearly 3 decades of service. He'd already trained his replacement and was counting down the days until he could return home to his wife. Frank's jaw tightened slightly at the mention of Margaret, a reaction not lost on Sarah Chen, who watched him with quiet empathy. On April 17, 2011, intelligence received word of multiple IEDs, improvised explosive devices, planted along Bia route where a convoy of 37 soldiers would be passing. Major Delaney and his team were deployed immediately to clear the route, Rodriguez continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone recounting sacred history. They found and disarmed 2 devices successfully, but as they approached the third, they discovered it wasn't a simple IED. It was what we call a daisy chain, multiple explosives linked together, designed to create a kill zone with no escape. A hushed silence fell over the cafe. Even those who knew little about military matters understood the gravity of what was being described. What made this situation particularly horrific, Rodriguez continued, was that the insurgents had used a child's body as cover for the trigger device. They knew our soldiers would want to provide proper care for the dead. It was a deliberate trap. Several gasps echoed through the cafe. An older woman covered her mouth in horror. Major Delaney's team was ordered to fall back. The risk was deemed too high. Air support was coming to neutralize the area from a distance, but that would mean... Rodriguez hesitated, looking at Frank, who nodded almost imperceptibly for him to continue. That would mean leaving the child's body to be destroyed in the blast. And it would mean accepting that the area would remain dangerous for local civilians long after our forces moved out. Terry Johnson, still processing everything he was hearing, looked at Frank with new eyes. "So what did you do?" he asked quietly. Frank remained silent, letting Rodriguez tell the story. Major Delaney ordered his team to evacuate, but he stayed behind, alone. He knew that if the devices detonated, the blast radius would catch the evacuation helicopter. So he did what few people on this earth could do. He began to disarm a complex explosive device manually, working literally underneath the body of a dead child, knowing that any mistake would be his last. Rodriguez's voice filled with unmistakable reverence. For 47 minutes, he worked with steady hands and absolute focus. As the final helicopter waited beyond safe distance, against direct orders, he disarmed not just the trigger, but all 4 connected devices. The captain turned to look directly at Frank. What the official report doesn't capture is that the final device was booby-trapped with a secondary trigger. As Major Delaney cut what should have been the last wire, a hidden pressure plate activated. The cafe was so silent you could hear the clock ticking behind the counter. In the quarter second he had to react, Major Delaney made a choice. Instead of pulling his hands away to save himself, he completed the disarming sequence. The partial detonation that followed caused irreparable nerve damage to both his hands, but he prevented the main charge from exploding. Rodriguez straightened his shoulders. 37 American soldiers lived because of what he did that day, and countless Afghan civilians were spared from living in a minefield of unexploded ordnance. Jake, who had been listening open-mouthed, finally found his voice. So his hands shake because he sacrificed his own safety to save others, Rodriguez finished. The tremors are permanent, a result of extensive nerve damage that no surgery could fully repair. Terry Johnson approached Frank slowly, respect and regret mingling on his face. "All this time, you've been coming in here and none of us knew." Frank shook his head slightly. "There was no reason for you to know, Mr. Johnson. I didn't come here for recognition." "No," Rodriguez agreed. "That's the thing about heroes like Major Delaney. They never do." Outside the cafe, Sergeant Major Washington, supervised as Melissa Winters, was secured in one of the military police vehicles. Her initial defiance had given way to a calculated silence as she assessed her situation with the cold pragmatism that had served her well throughout her criminal career. "You have nothing on me," she finally said as Washington checked her restraints. "It's my word against yours." Washington didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and removed a small tablet. After tapping the screen a few times, he turned it toward her. Rebecca Miller, age 28, from Phoenix, Arizona, he read from the file displayed. Or is it Jessica Thompson from San Diego? Or maybe Melissa Johnson, Terry Johnson's long-lost niece? He swiped through multiple ID photos, all showing the same woman with slightly different hair colors and styles. Melissa's expression didn't change, but a muscle twitched in her jaw. "You've been busy," Washington continued, scrolling through the extensive file. 6 different identities in 3 years, each time presenting yourself as the spouse of a deployed service member. Each time collecting donations, benefits, and support meant for actual military families. "Prove it," she challenged, though with less conviction than before. Washington tapped the screen again. Bank records showing transfers from the military. Family support fund to accounts opened under your various aliases. Surveillance footage from 3 different military bases where you collected donations. Sworn statements from 34 victims who contributed to your fraudulent causes. He scrolled further. And most damning of all, text messages between you and your associates discussing how to target vulnerable military communities and which support organizations had the fewest verification protocols. For the first time, genuine fear flickered across Melissa's face. "How did you find me?" she asked, her voice smaller now. Washington nodded toward the cafe. "That man you were mocking in there, the one with the shaking hands, his former subordinates, are now generals, colonels, and commanders across every branch of the military. When Lieutenant Chen's daughter recognized him and saw how you were treating him, she made one phone call. That's all it took." Inside the cafe, Corporal Fuller was briefing the other officers on what they had discovered in the back office of the Riverside Cafe. "We found these in her locker," Fuller reported, holding up a plastic evidence bag containing several ID cards and a stack of donation forms bearing the logo of a veterans support organization. Also a laptop with what appears to be a database of potential targets, military bases, support organizations, and individual service members' families. Terry Johnson looked devastated as he examined some of the forms. "These have my signature on them. She must have traced it from business documents." "That's her standard procedure," Fuller explained. "She establishes herself in a community with a connection to someone respected, like claiming to be your niece, then uses that legitimacy to access military support networks." "But why here?" Jake asked, still trying to process everything. "Riverside isn't exactly a military town. It's actually the perfect cover," one of the other officers explained. "Small town, tight-knit community, but not so small that everyone knows everyone. Close enough to Fort Carson to access military resources, but far enough away that military personnel aren't a common sight. So her stories wouldn't be easily verified." Captain Rodriguez, who had been conferring quietly with Frank, approached the group. "What's the estimated total she's taken?" Fuller consulted his notes. "Preliminary financial analysis suggests upwards of $400,000 over the past 3 years, but the impact goes beyond money. She's damaged trust in legitimate support organizations, which means some real military families may not get the help they need." Rodriguez's expression darkened. "And the others in her network?" "We've identified 3 associates based on communications found on her devices. Operations are underway to apprehend them now." Outside, Melissa was becoming increasingly agitated as the reality of her situation sank in. "I want to make a deal," she said suddenly. "I have information, names, accounts, everything. I can help you catch bigger fish." Washington regarded her impassively. "We already have most of what we need from your devices, but cooperation is always noted in sentencing recommendations." "You don't understand," Melissa insisted, leaning forward as much as her restraints would allow. "This isn't just about money. There's more going on. Identity theft, benefits fraud, it goes all the way up to the VA system." This caught Washington's attention. "Explain." "Not here," she said, glancing around. "And not without guarantees." Washington considered her for a moment, then nodded to one of the officers. "Take her statement at headquarters. Full recording, witnesses present. If her information has value, we'll talk to the prosecutor." As the officers prepared to transport Melissa, she looked back at the cafe one last time. Through the window, she could see Frank Delaney surrounded by respectful officers and civilians, finally recognized for who he truly was. For a brief moment, something like genuine shame flickered across her face, not for the money she had stolen, or the lies she had told, but for mocking a man whose quiet courage dwarfed anything she could imagine. Then the moment passed, and her expression hardened again into calculated self-preservation. "I'm ready to talk," she said, turning back to Washington. "But I want protection too. Some of the people involved won't be happy if they find out I'm cooperating." Washington nodded to the driver to begin the journey back to base. "That can be arranged, but first you'll need to make full disclosure, starting with how you targeted this town and why you chose to humiliate a decorated war hero." The Riverside Cafe had transformed in the span of 30 minutes. What began as an ordinary morning had become something profound, a moment of collective awakening that rippled through everyone present. As the military police vehicles pulled away with Melissa in custody, the cafe patrons remained gathered around Frank Delaney, their earlier indifference replaced by respectful attention. The revelation of his identity and service had shattered their comfortable assumptions, forcing a reckoning with their own behavior. "I've seen you in here every Thursday for 2 years," said an elderly woman who often sat by the window. "I never once said hello." Her voice trembled with regret. "My Harold was in Vietnam. He came home different too. I should have recognized." Frank shook his head gently. "There was nothing to recognize, ma'am. I'm just another customer." "No, sir, you're not," Terry Johnson said firmly. He had been hit hardest by the morning's revelations, not only learning that his supposed niece was a criminal, but realizing he had allowed the mistreatment of a hero in his establishment. "None of us saw you properly, and for that I am deeply sorry." A middle-aged man in a business suit stepped forward. "Major Delaney, my father served in Desert Storm. He never talked about it much, but he always stood up straighter when EOD teams were mentioned." The man extended his hand. "James Wilson, it's an honor to meet you, sir." Frank hesitated, then reached out to shake Wilson's hand. His tremor was visible, but Wilson grasped his hand firmly, with respect rather than pity in his eyes. One by one, other cafe patrons approached, each offering a word of appreciation or simply a nod of respect. The college students who had laughed at Melissa's cruel jokes hung back, their faces flushed with shame. Finally, one of them, a young woman with bright blue hair, approached tentatively. "Sir, I laughed when she made fun of your hands," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. I'm so sorry." Frank regarded her with the same steady gaze he had maintained throughout the morning's chaos. "We're all more than what others see at first glance," he said quietly. "Remember that, and we're square." The young woman's eyes filled with tears as she nodded gratefully. Captain Rodriguez watched these interactions with approval. Too often, veterans like Frank lived in isolation, their sacrifices unrecognized, their challenges misunderstood. Perhaps some good could come from this morning's events after all. Sarah Chen approached Frank again, this time extending a small object in her palm. "My father wanted you to have this," she said. "He carried it for years, but always said it belonged to you." Frank looked down at a tarnished challenge coin, a special token given to recognize outstanding service. This one bore the insignia of the EOD unit he had commanded in Afghanistan. "Jimmy kept this?" Frank asked. Genuine surprise in his voice. Sarah nodded. "He said it reminded him that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when you're terrified." Frank's fingers closed carefully around the coin, the metal warm from Sarah's hand. For the first time that morning, emotion broke through his composed exterior. A fleeting vulnerability quickly mastered, but not before those closest to him caught a glimpse of the depth of feeling beneath his stoic facade. Jake, who had been helping Terry clean up the mess from Melissa's outburst, suddenly spoke up. "My brother's in the Army," he said. "He's deployed right now. When I call him tonight, would it be okay if I told him I met you?" Frank looked uncomfortable with the request, but nodded. "If you'd like. He'd think it was pretty cool." Jake said simply, knowing that I got to meet someone like you. The bell above the cafe door chimed as two more people entered. An older couple, who were clearly locals, drawn by the unusual sight of military vehicles outside their favorite coffee shop. "What's going on?" the man asked, looking around at the gathered crowd. "Terry? Everything okay?" Before Terry could respond, one of the regular customers, a retired school teacher named Doris, stepped forward. "Richard, you remember how you're always saying we don't appreciate our veterans enough? Well, it turns out we've had a genuine hero among us all this time." As Doris began to explain, others joined in, each adding details they had learned about Frank's service and sacrifice. The story spread through the cafe like ripples in still water, changing everyone it touched. Frank, unaccustomed to being the center of attention, looked increasingly uncomfortable. Captain Rodriguez noticed and smoothly intervened. "Major General, Marshall is expecting a full report. Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private?" Frank nodded gratefully. But as he prepared to leave, Terry Johnson stepped forward once more. "Major Delaney," he said formally, "I'd be honored if you would return to the Riverside Cafe whenever you wish. Your coffee will be on the house for as long as I own this place." Frank began to protest, but Terry held up his hand. "It's not charity, sir, it's respect. And it's long overdue." The assembled patrons murmured their agreement, many nodding emphatically. In the span of a single morning, everything had changed, not just for Frank Delaney, but for an entire community that had been given the chance to see beyond the surface, to recognize the extraordinary in what they had mistaken for ordinary. As Captain Rodriguez guided Frank toward the door, the noise and attention of the cafe began to fade into the background. Frank's mind, usually so disciplined and present, slipped sideways into memory, the way it sometimes did when the past refused to stay buried. The cafe, the faces, the voices all dissolved, replaced by the harsh sunlight of Kandahar Province, April 17th, 2011. The day that changed everything. He could feel the weight of the EOD suit again, 80 pounds of protective gear that never seemed quite enough when facing devices designed specifically to kill. The heat was oppressive, sweat rolling down his back, his face shield fogging slightly with each measured breath. "Major, we've got a third device," came Lieutenant Chen's voice through his headset. 2 o'clock, approximately 50 meters. Frank remembered scanning the dusty road ahead, noting the disturbed earth that marked a recently dug hole. Too obvious, which immediately put him on alert. Insurgents had become sophisticated in their tactics, using obvious devices to distract from more cleverly hidden ones. "Approach with caution," he had ordered. Possible decoy. The memory was crystal clear now. Clearer, sometimes, than his present life. He could smell the dust, the explosive residue from the first 2 devices they had already disarmed, the faint odor of fear that no amount of deodorant could mask. As they drew closer, he saw it, the small body half buried in the loose soil. A child no more than 6 or 7 years old, positioned directly over where the IED would be. "They're using the dead as bait now," Chen had said, his voice tight with controlled rage. Frank had felt it too, the visceral anger at this desecration, this exploitation of innocence. But anger was dangerous in EOD work. Emotion clouded judgment, and clouded judgment got people killed. "Focus on the device, not the tactic," he had reminded his team and himself. The memory shifted, accelerated. The radio call ordering immediate evacuation, air support inbound to neutralize the area from a distance, his team's reluctant withdrawal. "Major, we need to go now," Chen had insisted. "Those are direct orders." "Get the team to the extraction point," Frank had replied, his decision already made. "I'll be right behind you." It was a lie, and they both knew it. There wasn't time to disarm the device and make the extraction, but there also wasn't time to argue. In his memory, Frank could see Jimmy Chen's face, the conflict there, the understanding, the reluctant acceptance. Then Chen was gone, leading the rest of the team back toward the waiting helicopter, leaving Frank alone with the dead child and the hidden death beneath. The procedure came back to him in vivid detail. The careful removal of soil around the small body, the delicate work of checking for pressure plates or motion sensors. The discovery of the first wire, then the second. The realization that this was far more complex than a standard IED. He remembered the moment he identified the daisy chain, 4 devices linked together, covering nearly the entire road width. If detonated, it would have left no escape route. For the convoy scheduled to pass through later that day, 37 men and women who would never have made it home. The radio had squawked again. General Hayes himself, this time. "Delaney, get out of there now. That's a direct order. We're going to neutralize the area in 10 minutes with or without you." "With respect, sir," Frank had replied, "I've identified a complex daisy chain device. If I leave it and you strike from the air, you'll likely trigger only part of it. The road will remain deadly for any civilian who passes through later. That's a risk we have to take. Your life is worth more than—" "Sir, I've already begun the disarming procedure. Can't stop midway safely. I'll report when it's clear." He had removed his headset then, focusing entirely on the deadly puzzle before him. One wire at a time, one device at a time. Slow, methodical work that required absolute concentration. 43 minutes later, he had nearly finished. 3 devices disarmed, only the trigger mechanism remaining. His hands had been steady then, surgeon steady, as they'd always been in the field. The final wire waited, a thin red line against the improvised circuit board. He remembered the slight resistance as his cutters closed on the wire, the faint click that shouldn't have been there, the fraction of a second where he realized there was a hidden backup trigger, and the instant decision to complete the cut anyway, knowing what would happen, but knowing also that pulling back would trigger the main charge, then pain. Blinding, white-hot pain as the small secondary charge detonated, sending fragments of metal and plastic through his gloves and into his hands. He remembered looking down and seeing blood, seeing his fingers still moving, but somehow wrong. Somehow. Not entirely under his control anymore, but the main charge had remained stable. The deadly daisy chain had been broken. In the present, Frank blinked, the memory receding as Captain Rodriguez's voice broke through. "Major, are you all right?" Frank found himself standing outside the cafe, the morning sun warm on his face, so different from the scorching Kandahar heat of his memories. His hands were trembling more severely than usual. They always did after these vivid flashbacks. "Fine, Captain," he said quietly, just remembering. Rodriguez nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Some things stay with us, sir." "Yes," Frank agreed, flexing his fingers carefully, feeling the familiar pain and limited response. "But we carry on anyway." The military police convoy carrying Melissa Winters arrived at Fort Carson with an efficiency that spoke of well-established protocols. As the primary vehicle pulled into the secure processing area, Sergeant Major Washington noticed a familiar figure waiting for them, Colonel Victor Ramirez, the man who had set the morning's events in motion. "Colonel," Washington acknowledged with a crisp salute. "Target secured and evidence collected." Ramirez nodded, his eyes moving to the patrol car where Melissa sat, still handcuffed. "Any resistance?" "Verbal only. She's already offering information in exchange for leniency." A thin smile crossed Ramirez's face. "They always do. Walk with me." As they moved toward the administration building, Ramirez lowered his voice. "This case goes beyond fraud, Sergeant Major. The network she's part of has been targeting vulnerable military families for years. They've stolen identities, redirected benefits, even intercepted death gratuities meant for Gold Star families." Washington's expression hardened. As a career military man, few things angered him more than those who preyed on service members and their families. "How deep does it go?" "That's what we're about to find out," Ramirez replied, nodding toward the building where 2 JAG officers and a federal prosecutor were already waiting. "But based on preliminary data from her devices, we believe she's connected to at least 3 other major players, possibly more." Inside the interrogation room, Melissa's calculated composure was beginning to crack. The federal prosecutor, a stern woman named Catherine Diaz, laid out the evidence methodically. Bank records, witnessy, statements, surveillance footage, Digital communications. Ms. Winters, we have enough to put you away for 15 to 20 years, Diaz concluded, closing the thick file. Federal charges of wire fraud, identity theft, stolen valor, and misappropriation of government funds. Melissa swallowed hard, her gaze darting between the prosecutor and the JAG officers. I want immunity. That's not on the table, Diaz replied flatly. But cooperation could mean the difference between maximum and minimum sentencing guidelines. For the first time, genuine fear showed in Melissa's eyes. You don't understand. I'm small time compared to the others. They won't just let me talk. One of the JAG officers leaned forward. We can offer protection if your information leads to additional arrests. Melissa considered this, weighing her limited options with the cold pragmatism that had defined her criminal career. Finally, she nodded. Marcus Shepard is the one you want, she said. Ex-military himself, dishonorable discharge in 2014. He coordinates everything, identifies targets, creates false documentation, handles the money. He's got people working VA offices, benefits administration, even charity organizations. As Melissa began detailing the network's operations, Washington and Ramirez observed from behind the one-way glass. She's giving up everything, Washington noted. Ramirez nodded. Self-preservation. But it checks out with what we already suspected. Shepard's been on our radar for months. What about Delaney? Was he targeted specifically? I've been wondering that myself, Ramirez admitted. Let's find out. Back in the interrogation room, Diaz was directing the conversation toward the morning's events. Tell us about Frank Delaney, she said. Why were you mocking a decorated veteran? Melissa looked confused. Who? The old guy with the shaky hands? I didn't know who he was. You expect us to believe that your presence in the same small-town cafe as a highly decorated EOD officer was coincidental? When your organization specifically targets military personnel, it was, Melissa insisted. I picked Riverside because it was close enough to the base to be useful, but far enough that people wouldn't easily verify my stories. I had no idea who that old man was until your people showed up. The JAG officers exchanged glances. Her response rang true. Melissa's typical targets were active duty families and support organizations, not retired veterans living quiet lives. So, the way you treated him? Diaz pressed. Melissa had the decency to look slightly ashamed, though whether it was genuine or performative was hard to tell. I was just being a bitch, okay? He was slow, his hand shook. He took forever counting change. I thought it was funny. She looked down at her own hands. I didn't know why he was like that. Behind the glass, Washington made a disgusted noise, picking on him because he was an easy target. That's almost worse than if she'd done it deliberately. Ramirez nodded grimly. Cruelty without purpose, just because she could. The questioning continued for hours as Melissa detailed the fraud. Operation, names, dates, methods, amounts. With each revelation, the case expanded, implicating individuals across multiple states. By late afternoon, arrest warrants had been issued for Marcus Shepard and 2 other key members of the network. Financial accounts were frozen, digital assets seized, and a coordinated operation was underway to dismantle the entire organization. We've got enough to put them all away for a very long time, Diaz told Ramirez as they reviewed the preliminary charges. Ms. Winters will still serve significant time, but her cooperation has been substantial. Ramirez nodded, satisfaction evident in his posture, if not his expression. Justice served then, or at least justice begun. As evening approached, Washington received a call from Captain Rodriguez, updating him on Major Delaney's status. The Sergeant Major listened carefully, then turned to Ramirez. Sir, you're going to want to hear this. It seems the town of Riverside is having quite the reaction to learning about Major Delaney. Ramirez raised an eyebrow, gesturing for Washington to continue. Apparently, they're organizing something. Captain Rodriguez thinks we should be there. Tomorrow morning. For the first time that day, Ramirez allowed himself a small smile. I believe we can arrange that, Sergeant Major. I believe we can arrange that indeed. After the commotion at the cafe had settled, Captain Rodriguez suggested that Frank might prefer a quieter setting. They ended up at Riverside Park, a small green space near the center of town, where the noise of traffic faded beneath the rustling of oak leaves and the gentle flow of the namesake river. Frank sat on a bench overlooking the water, his trembling hands resting on his knees. The morning's events had taken more out of him than he cared to admit. Years of carefully maintained anonymity had been shattered in the space of minutes, leaving him exposed in ways that made him profoundly uncomfortable. General Marshall sends her sincere regrets that she couldn't come herself, Rodriguez said, sitting beside Frank but maintaining a respectful distance. She's overseeing an operation that couldn't be postponed, Frank nodded. Catherine was always dedicated. Good to hear she's made general. She credits you with her career. Says your training methods should be standard across all EOD units. Key hint of pride flickered across Frank's face before disappearing behind his usual reserve. She was an exceptional officer, would have succeeded with or without me. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, the kind of quiet understood by those who have served, a shared language that required no words. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the moment. Frank looked up to see Sarah Chen walking toward them, carrying a small paper bag from the cafe. Terry insisted I bring these, she said, holding up the bag. Cranberry muffins. He said they were your wife's favorite. Frank's expression softened at the mention of Margaret. They were, he confirmed. Thank you, Sarah hesitated, then gestured to the empty space on the bench. May I join you? At Frank's nod, she sat down, placing the bag of muffins between them. For a moment, none of them spoke, the gentle sounds of the park filling the silence. I owe you an explanation, Sarah finally said, about how I recognized you and why I made that call. Frank studied her face, young, earnest, with the unmistakable determination he had seen in her father. Lieutenant Chen was a good officer, he said simply. Sarah smiled, a bittersweet expression. He was, and he never forgot what happened in Kandahar. She reached into her jacket pocket and removed a small notebook, its cover worn with age and use. He kept this journal during his deployments. After he died, I found it among his things. She carefully opened the notebook to a dog-eared page and handed it to Frank. His hands trembled as he took it, making the task of reading difficult, but he managed to focus on the neat handwriting. April 17th, 2011. I thought today was my last. We all did. The IED was beyond anything we'd trained for. When the evac order came, there was relief, then shame for feeling relieved. But Major D stayed behind. I wanted to stay too, but he ordered us out. As our chopper lifted, I watched him. Through binoculars, kneeling beside that dead child, working with the steady hands that have saved us so many times before. I don't know if I could have made that choice. I pray I never have to find out. Frank closed the notebook gently, returning it to Sarah with hands that trembled more than usual. Jimmy was always too hard on himself, he said quietly. He would have stayed if I'd let him. That was his nature. Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. He told me stories about you, his commander who could disarm anything, who never left anyone behind, who taught him that courage isn't about being fearless. She took a deep breath, composing herself. After he came home, he kept track of you. He knew you'd retired to Riverside after your wife died. He wanted to visit, to thank you properly, but he wasn't sure you'd want to see reminders of that time. I would have welcomed him, Frank said, genuine regret in his voice. He was diagnosed with cancer 2 years after returning home, Sarah continued. Agent Orange exposure from his first tour. By the time they caught it, it was already stage 4. Rodriguez bowed his head slightly, a soldier's acknowledgement of a fallen comrade. Before he died, he made me promise something, Sarah said. He said, if you ever find yourself in Riverside, look for Major Delaney. Make sure he's not forgotten. Her voice wavered slightly. I moved here 3 months ago to finish my graduate thesis. I've been coming to that cafe hoping to see you, but I wasn't sure it was really you until today. Frank was silent for a long moment, processing all she had shared. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but steady. Your father saved my life once. Did he tell you that? Early in the tour, he spotted a trigger wire I'd missed, shouted a warning just in time. Sarah shook her head. He never mentioned that. That was Jimmy. Remembered what others did for him, forgot what he did for them. Frank's gaze drifted to the river, memories flowing as steadily as the water. A good man, one of the best I served with. He said the same about you, Sarah replied softly. Then, with careful movements, she removed something else from her pocket, a small velvet pouch. There's one more thing he wanted you to have. From the pouch, she withdrew a tarnished silver star medal, identical to the one Frank had received, but had never displayed. This was his. He said it really belonged to you, because without you, he wouldn't have lived to receive it. Frank looked at the medal, but made no move to take it. That's his honor. It should stay with his family. Sarah placed it gently in his trembling hand, closing his fingers around it with her own steady ones. It is, and now it's where he wanted it to be. News travels quickly in small towns, and Riverside was no exception. By mid-afternoon, the story of Frank Delaney had spread from the cafe to the barbershop, from the hardware store to the library, from neighbor to neighbor across fences and through phone calls. With each retelling, the community's collective shame deepened, as did their determination to make amends. Terry Johnson had closed the Riverside Cafe early, hanging a handwritten sign on the door. Closed for special event. Preparation. Inside, he and Jake worked alongside volunteers who had appeared as if summoned, rearranging furniture and hanging decorations with military precision. The banner should be higher on the right, directed Doris, the retired school teacher who had appointed herself coordinator of what was rapidly becoming a town-wide effort. And we need more chairs. Harold, can you bring some from the community center? Harold, her husband of 45 years, nodded and hurried off, grateful for the task. Like many in Riverside that day, he was processing a complicated mix of emotions, regret for not having recognized the quiet hero in their midst, determination to do better, and a strange, fierce pride that someone like Frank Delaney had chosen their town as his home. At the Veterans Affairs office in the next county, phones rang continuously as word spread through military networks. Sergeant James Kelly, the local VA representative and a Desert Storm veteran himself, found himself overwhelmed with calls from former EOD specialists, officers who had served with Frank, and military brass inquiring about the morning's events. "Yes, sir, we've confirmed it was definitely Major Delaney," Kelly told a retired colonel from Fort Carson. "No, sir, he's never registered with our office for services." Kelly listened for a moment. "I understand completely. We'll make sure." He knows about the benefits available to him. As Kelly hung up, his assistant looked at him curiously. "Another one who served with Delaney?" Kelly nodded, a mix of respect and frustration on his face. "That's the fifth call from someone whose life he apparently saved, and yet he's never once come to us for help, despite qualifying for full disability benefits." He shook his head. Typical of that generation, too proud to ask for what they've earned. Across town at the Riverside Gazette, editor-in-chief Martha Wilson was hastily rearranging the next day's front page. The story about the school board meeting would have to wait. This was bigger, much bigger. "I want interviews with anyone who knows him," she instructed her small staff. Respectful ones, mind you. No prying into his military service unless he volunteers it. Focus on how he's been part of this community without any of us realizing who he was. Her senior reporter, Tom Alvarez, looked up from his notepad. "I checked our archives. We actually have a photo of him from last year's Memorial Day ceremony. He's in the background, standing at attention during the national anthem. No one even noticed him." Martha's expression softened. "Use that photo tastefully." By late afternoon, Sarah Chen had received 17 text messages and 9 phone calls from neighbors and acquaintances, all asking the same question. Was it true about the old man with the shaky hands? "Yes, it's true," she confirmed to Mrs. Abernathy from the library. "He was my father's commanding officer in Afghanistan. He's a hero, though he'd never use that word himself." "We've seen him for years," Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice tinged with regret. checking out history books, sitting quietly in the reading room, such a polite man. And all this time he was just living his life, Sarah finished for her. That's all he wants to do now. Well, he's going to get a proper thank you first, Mrs. Abernathy declared firmly. I'm bringing my molasses cookies to the cafe tomorrow. They were my son's favorite when he was in the service. Similar conversations were happening all over Riverside as the community mobilized around a shared purpose. At the hardware store, Bill McKenzie was organizing a group of volunteers to repair Frank's porch steps, a project he'd noticed needed attention months ago but had never mentioned to the reserved homeowner. Man's been living with a broken step. For who knows how long, Bill told his impromptu crew, we're fixing it tomorrow, no arguments, no payment accepted. At the First Baptist Church, Reverend Thomas added a special mention to the evening prayer service, not naming Frank directly, but asking for blessings on those whose quiet heroism goes unrecognized among us. The mayor, upon hearing the story, immediately called an emergency session of the town council. This isn't just about one man, he told the hastily assembled members. It's about what kind of community we want to be, one that overlooks its heroes or one that honors them. By sunset, what had begun as a small gathering planned for the Riverside Cafe had evolved into something much larger. Calls were made, permits fast-tracked, streets scheduled for temporary closure. The small town of Riverside, which had overlooked Frank Delaney for years, was now determined to ensure he would never be invisible again. As evening fell, Captain Rodriguez made his final call of the day to Colonel Ramirez. "Sir, you're not going to believe what's happening here," he reported. "The entire town is mobilizing. They're planning something for tomorrow morning at 0900 at the cafe where it all started." "We'll be there," Ramirez replied without hesitation. "And Captain, bring Delaney, whether he wants to come or not. Some recognition can't be avoided, nor should it be." 1 week after the incident at the Riverside Cafe, Frank Delaney stood uncomfortably in his best suit, the same one he had worn to Margaret's funeral 5 years earlier. Captain Rodriguez had arrived at his house 30 minutes ago with a polite but firm request that Frank accompany him to the cafe for a small gathering. Frank had initially refused, preferring to return to his quiet routine rather than face more attention, but Rodriguez had been prepared for this resistance. "Sir, with respect, it's not just for you," the captain had explained. "It's for them too. They need this." So now Frank found himself approaching the cafe, Rodriguez at his side, surprised to see Maple Street blocked off to traffic and a crowd gathered outside the familiar storefront. As they drew closer, Frank slowed his pace, taken aback by the size of the assembly. "I thought you said a small gathering," he said, his voice low. Rodriguez smiled apologetically. "It appears the town had other ideas, sir." Indeed, it seemed all of Riverside had turned out. Families with children, elderly couples, teenagers, and business owners stood shoulder to shoulder in front of the cafe. A temporary platform had been erected near the entrance, with chairs arranged in neat rows facing it. As Frank approached, the crowd parted silently, creating a path to the platform. Many people nodded respectfully as he passed. Some placed their hands over their hearts. A few veterans offered crisp salutes, which Frank, despite his discomfort, returned out of habit and respect. On the platform stood Terry Johnson, Mayor Wilson, and to Frank's surprise, Colonel Ramirez and Brigadier General Catherine Marshall in full dress uniform. Seeing his former subordinate, now his superior officer, Frank straightened instinctively, his military bearing reasserting itself, despite the years of retirement. "Major Delaney," General Marshall greeted him warmly, extending her hand. "It's been too long," Frank shook her hand, managing a small smile. "Congratulations on the promotion, Catherine. Well deserved." "I learned from the best," she replied, her voice carrying enough for those nearest to hear. Mayor Wilson stepped forward next, guiding Frank to a seat of honor on the platform. "Major Delaney, on behalf of Riverside, I want to welcome you to this special occasion." Frank sat reluctantly, hyper-aware of the hundreds of eyes upon him. The mayor approached a microphone set up at the center of the platform. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and neighbors, 1 week ago today, our community witnessed something extraordinary. We discovered that a hero has been living among us, quietly, humbly, asking for no recognition or special treatment. The mayor gestured toward Frank. For years, Major Frank Delaney has been our neighbor, sharing our streets, our shops, our everyday lives. Many of us saw him regularly but never truly saw him, never recognized the sacrifices he made in service to our country or the courage he demonstrated throughout his distinguished military career. Frank's gaze drifted over the assembled crowd, recognizing familiar faces: the librarian who helped him find history books, the pharmacist who filled his prescriptions, neighbors who had exchanged nothing more than casual nods over the years, all looking at him now with new eyes. Today, the mayor continued, we gather not just to honor Major Delaney's military service, but to acknowledge our own failure as a community. We failed to see, to understand, to extend the respect and gratitude he deserved. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unaccustomed to being the center of such attention. Terry Johnson stepped forward next, visibly nervous, but determined. A week ago, in my cafe, I witnessed something I'll never forget. I saw cruelty met with dignity, mockery met with silence, disrespect met with forbearance. I saw Major Delaney face treatment that would have provoked anger from most of us, and he did it with the same quiet strength he must have shown on the battlefield. Terry's voice cracked slightly. I want to publicly apologize for what happened in my establishment, and to thank you, sir, for showing us what true character looks like. Frank nodded once, accepting the apology with characteristic reserve. Colonel Ramirez approached the microphone next. For those who may not understand the significance of Major Delaney's service, allow me to provide some context. In the field of explosive ordnance disposal, there is no margin for error. One mistake means lives lost, often many lives. Throughout his 27-year career, Major Delaney never lost a single team member under his command, a record that remains unmatched to this day. A respectful silence fell over the crowd as the colonel continued. The tremor in his hands that some thoughtlessly mocked is the physical manifestation of his final act of heroism, an injury sustained while saving 37 American soldiers and countless Afghan civilians. General Marshall took her turn. At the microphone, her voice carrying the authority of high command. The United States Army has not forgotten Major Frank Delaney, even if he has preferred to live quietly among you. His training methods and field manual continue to save lives today. His example inspires new generations of EOD specialists. She turned to face Frank directly. And it is my honor today, on behalf of a grateful nation, to present this plaque, which will be permanently installed here at the Riverside Cafe, where 1 week ago, the true meaning of service and sacrifice was so powerfully demonstrated. 2 uniformed soldiers unveiled a bronze plaque mounted on polished wood. Its inscription read, "In honor of Major Frank Delaney, United States Army, RETI, Explosive Ordnance Disposal Specialist, Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart," who reminds us that true heroism often walks quietly among us, dedicated by the grateful. Citizens of Riverside, May 2023. Frank stared at the plaque, emotions warring beneath his composed exterior. For a man who had spent years avoiding recognition, this public acknowledgement was deeply uncomfortable. Yet he could not deny the genuine respect and regret emanating from the community gathered before him. While Riverside honored Frank Delaney 50 miles away at the Federal Detention Center, Melissa Winters sat alone in a small conference room, waiting for her court-appointed attorney. The past week had stripped away her carefully constructed persona, leaving her in standard-issue clothing with her natural hair color growing out at the roots, physical manifestations of her crumbling facade. The door opened, and a middle-aged woman in a crisp suit entered, carrying a thick folder. "Ms. Winters, I'm Rebecca Torres, your defense attorney." Melissa straightened. adopting the vulnerable expression that had served her well in previous manipulations. "Thank you for coming. This has all been a terrible misunderstanding." "Save it," Torres interrupted, setting down her folder with practiced efficiency. "I've reviewed the evidence. There's no misunderstanding here." She opened the folder, revealing photographs, bank statements, and transcripts. "The prosecution has an airtight case with multiple witnesses, documented fraud across 4 states, and your own digital communications outlining the schemes." Melissa's facade dropped, replaced by cold calculation. "So what are my options?" "Limited," Torres replied bluntly. "The federal prosecutor is offering a plea deal based on your cooperation. 15 years instead of 30, eligibility for parole after serving 10. In exchange, you provide complete details on your network, testify against your associates, and make restitution." 10 years? Melissa's voice rose in disbelief. "That's ridiculous. I didn't hurt anyone. It was just money." Torres leveled a steady gaze at her client. "It wasn't just money. It was funds meant for families of deployed service members, children waiting for parents who might not come home, widows struggling to rebuild their lives." She pulled out a particular file. "The Robinson family lost their benefits for 3 months because you diverted them. Their 8-year-old daughter couldn't get her asthma medication. For the first time, Melissa seemed to register the real impact of her actions. A flicker of something, perhaps not quite remorse, but at least recognition, crossed her face. The prosecutor also mentioned your behavior toward Major Delaney factored into their charging decisions," Torres continued. "Apparently mocking a decorated veteran with service-connected disabilities didn't play well." Melissa looked down at her hands. "I didn't know who he was." "Would it have mattered if you had?" Torres asked sharply. The question hung in the air, unanswered. "Here's what you need to understand," Torres said, her tone softening slightly. "The evidence against you is overwhelming. Your associates are already turning on each other. Marcus Shepard was arrested yesterday, and he's trying to cut his own deal by claiming you were the mastermind." "That's a lie," Melissa exclaimed. "It was all his idea. He recruited me after we met at a VA fundraiser." "Then tell the truth," Torres advised. "Full disclosure, genuine remorse, and cooperation are your only path to a reduced sentence." Melissa fell silent, contemplating her options. Finally, she nodded. "What do I need to do?" "First, write a complete statement detailing your involvement and naming all associates. Then, the prosecutor wants something else, a letter of apology." "To who?" "All the people we scammed. There are hundreds." "No," Torres said, sliding a blank piece of paper across the table. "To Major Frank Delaney." Melissa's expression froze. "The old man from the cafe? Why?" "Because sometimes justice isn't just about punishment. It's about acknowledging the harm done. The prosecutor thinks it would be educational for you." For several minutes, Melissa stared at the blank page. Then, with a resigned sigh, she picked up the pen Torres offered. "Dear Major Delaney," she began, the words coming slowly at first, "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I owe you an apology for how I treated you at the Riverside Cafe." She paused, struggling with what to say next. How did one apologize for cruelty that had been so casual, so thoughtless? For mockery based on a disability earned through heroism she couldn't comprehend? "I made fun of your hands," she continued, "without knowing or caring why they shake. I now understand that your tremors came from saving lives, from choosing to put others before yourself. I can't imagine making that kind of choice." As she wrote, something unexpected happened. The exercise intended as a formality, a box to check in her plea agreement, began to affect her. Words flowed more easily as she confronted the reality of what she had done, not just to Frank, but to all her victims. "I've spent years pretending to be connected to the military, claiming a sacrifice I never made, while you actually sacrificed and asked for nothing in return. I used people's respect for service members to steal from them, while you earned that respect and never used it for personal gain." By the time she finished the letter, Melissa's hands were trembling slightly. Not from nerve damage like Frank's, but from the unfamiliar weight of genuine remorse. Torres read the letter carefully, surprised by its sincerity. "This is, actually, quite good, Ms. Winters. I think it will help your case." "Will he really get it?" Melissa asked quietly. "That's up to him," Torres replied. "But yes, it will be offered to him." As Torres gathered her materials to leave, Melissa had one more question. "What happened to him after I was arrested?" Torres paused at the door. "From what I understand, the town of Riverside is holding some kind of ceremony for him today. Apparently, once people learned who he really was, they wanted to make amends for having overlooked him for so long." After her attorney left, Melissa remained at the table, contemplating the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this point. Her attempt to exploit the military community had ultimately led to a genuine hero receiving long overdue recognition. It wasn't redemption, she was far from that, but perhaps it was the beginning of understanding the true meaning of the values she had only pretended to respect. 6 months after the ceremony that had so uncomfortably thrust him into the spotlight, Frank Delaney stood behind the counter of the Riverside Cafe, his trembling hands carefully guiding those of a young veteran named Michael, who was learning to operate the espresso machine. "Easy on the pressure," Frank advised quietly. "Too much force, and you'll compact the grounds too tightly." Michael nodded, his own hands unsteady from injuries sustained in Syria 2 years earlier. "Like this?" "That's it," Frank confirmed. "You're getting the hang of it." The Riverside Cafe had transformed in the month since Melissa's arrest and the town's awakening to Frank's presence among them. Terry Johnson had approached Frank with an unexpected proposal to help create a veteran-friendly workspace where those struggling with the transition to civilian life could find employment, community, and purpose. At first, Frank had refused. He had no interest in being the face of any initiative, preferring his quiet anonymity. But Terry had been persistent. "It's not about making you a spectacle," he had explained. "It's about creating something meaningful from what happened, something that helps others like you." Eventually, Frank had agreed to serve as a mentor, coming in 3 mornings a week to train the young veterans Terry hired. The first had been Michael, a former Army Ranger whose PTSD and physical injuries had made conventional employment challenging. "Major Delaney, could you check this latte art?" called Jake from the second espresso station. The young man had stayed on after Melissa's departure, now attending community college while working part-time. His attitude toward the older customers had undergone a remarkable transformation. Frank moved over to inspect Jake's work, a carefully crafted leaf pattern, in the foam. "Well done," he nodded. "Your steady hand is coming along nicely." The morning rush was in full swing, the cafe bustling with its usual mix of regulars and newcomers. What had changed was the atmosphere, a warmth and inclusivity that hadn't existed before. The small bronze plaque by the entrance served as a quiet reminder of the cafe's commitment to respect and service. Sarah Chen entered, laptop bag slung over her shoulder. She had become a regular fixture, often working at her corner table while keeping a protective eye on Frank. Their unusual friendship had deepened over the months, she providing a connection to his military past through her father's memories, he offering the wisdom and perspective she had lost when her father died. "Morning, Major," she greeted, the formality a private joke between them now. "Morning, Lieutenant's daughter," he returned with the hint of a smile. Behind Sarah came Mrs. Abernathy from the library, carrying a small package. "Frank, these books you requested just arrived. I brought them over rather than making you come to pick them up." "That's very kind, thank you," Frank said, accepting the package with hands that still trembled, but somehow seemed less noticeable. Now, perhaps because no one in Riverside saw them as a weakness anymore. The door chimed again as Bill McKenzie from the hardware store entered. "Frank, that gutter repair at your place is all set. Me and the boys took care of it yesterday while you were here." Frank began to protest. He'd grown uncomfortable with the town's persistent helpfulness, but Bill waved him off. "Don't even start. Consider it payment for that talk you gave my nephew's ROTC group last month. Kid hasn't stopped talking about it since." The unexpected role of reluctant community elder had been thrust upon Frank despite his best efforts to avoid it. Invitations to speak at schools, mentor young veterans, advise the local emergency response team, all had found their way to his door. He declined more than he accepted, but found himself saying yes more often than he would have predicted. As the morning progressed, Frank noticed an unfamiliar figure enter, a man in his 60s, wearing a Marine Corps cap. The stranger looked around uncertainly until his eyes found Frank behind the counter. With a nod of recognition, he approached. "Major Delaney?" he asked, standing almost at attention. "Colonel James Mercer, USMC, retired. I read about you in the Military Times. Drove up from Colorado Springs this morning." Frank dried his hands on a towel, extending one to shake Mercer's. "What can I do for you, Colonel?" "Nothing, sir. I came to say thank you." Mercer's voice roughened slightly. "My son was one of the 37 in that convoy in Kandahar. The one that would have hit your IED if you hadn't stayed behind." A hush fell over the nearby tables as customers pretended not to listen while absorbing every word. "He made it home because of you," Mercer continued. "Got married last year. Has a baby on the way, my first grandchild." Frank nodded, uncomfortable with the gratitude, but accepting it with grace. "I'm glad to hear it. Your son did the hard part, serving his country with honor." "As did you," Mercer replied. "Some debts can never be repaid, but they should always be acknowledged." As Mercer took a seat at the counter, Frank returned to his work, guiding Michael through the next order. His hands still trembled. They always would. But they remained capable, useful, strong in ways that mattered. Through the cafe window, Frank could see Maple Street bustling with morning activity. The same street where military police had arrived. 6 months earlier, setting in motion changes none could have predicted. His gaze traveled to the cemetery hill in the distance, where he still visited Margaret each morning, telling her about his increasingly complicated life. "She'd be proud of you," Sarah said quietly, somehow reading his thoughts as she passed by with her coffee. "For finally letting people see you," Frank allowed himself a small smile. "She always said my worst habit was disappearing when I was standing right in front of people." "Not anymore," Sarah replied, "not in this town." And it was true. In Riverside, Frank Delaney's hands would always shake, but he would never again be invisible.